This is a podcast reaction to a podcast by Lanz Precht. It's a German podcast, and the title of the episode is Einstürzende Altbauten. Now, apologies, it's a German podcast, and I'm going to do this now in English just to keep the consistency with the podcast. The Not Even On podcast is an English-speaking podcast, and this is a German podcast. Now, let me caveat this a little bit. I've started looking outside of the US to get a little bit more inspiration about how other people see us. I'm wherever I can, of course, find information, whether it's China or Singapore or the Middle East or Europe. And Germany is actually pretty fruitful ground for these types of things because the one thing that Germany has, in my opinion, which is probably stronger than anywhere else, is really a freedom of opinion and freedom of speech. And that's probably sort of a relic from post-World War II and the horrible history that Germany had, and actually even had after World War II in East Germany. So that got even reinforced after unification, that you really don't want to interfere with censorship and those sort of things. Unfortunately, we don't have that here in the US, partly because nobody has ever lived under a really censorship type regime, and therefore the risk actually of falling into a 1984 type nightmare is much higher. And given the technology leverage that Silicon Valley has over freedom of expression and freedom of opinion, this is a very concerning thing. But that's a side note here. Let's get to the podcast. The podcast is about debt and about the usefulness of government debt. And I wanted to react to that because I think for me personally, the biggest issue in this election cycle in the United States is the government debt of the United States. So I want to elaborate on that. And I want to answer the question that Lanz Precht asked in the podcast, which is, what's wrong with debt? And why are we Germans so obsessed with not having debt? And the answer is, debt is the cocaine of finance. I used to do a little, then a little won't do, so I started doing more and more. This is a line from Mr. Brownstone, Guns N' Roses song. And that's the problem with debt in a nutshell, right? A little bit of debt here and then, in theory, is not a problem. Actually, could be a good thing. The problem is, of course, once you get used to it and you start doing more and more, it turns into a Keynesian nightmare. So I want to discuss some of the points that were made, also comment on a particular comment, on a particular statement that was made about a certain author. The name eludes me right now, but the point was that something like that capitalism only works in a place where actually communism should be implied, because capitalism relies on the sort of voluntary exchange of goods that aren't rationally measured. And if we measure everything and rationalize everything, then the whole thing falls apart. I think that's nonsense. So I want to talk about that too. But overall, I think it's, again, I mean, this is not a critique, like in a sense, like I'm not saying they're wrong, or I'm not saying what they're saying is nonsense or anything like that. All I'm trying to do here is just have my reaction, my comments, my debate towards their points that were made. This is Not Even On podcast. It's September 25th, 2024. This is Krimdelko. This is the second episode of today. So for the year, we're up 24.5%. The market's up 19.7%. We're outperforming by 4.8%. So this is a critique or a reaction to Lanz Precht episode 159, Einstürzende Altbauten. So let me give the context first. So they talk about a certain bridge that collapsed in Dresden. And the question is, Germany needs to invest in infrastructure, to fix their infrastructure, highways, bridges, all that kind of stuff. And then they raise the question, well, why don't we just use government debt to invest in infrastructure? And what's wrong with that? And why are Germans so obsessed with not having debt and so obsessed with balancing their budget and all of that stuff? So this is not just a myth. This is actually true. The Germans, even today, in a debt-laden, Keynesian proliferate, scene around the world where every country, starting with Japan, number one, but then U.S. and everybody else has just debt to the gazoo and spends it on Keynesian type of projects, and Germany is still very frugal when it comes to that. So the question is why, and is that a good thing? That's what they're asking, which is a legitimate question. I want to give my answer right away and then elaborate on the point. So my answer is yes, it's a very good thing. It's a phenomenal thing, because what you want to do as a state, as a nation, as a society is always try to leave as much money in the pockets of individuals as you can, and then incentivize entrepreneurs to build the kinds of products and services that the society needs. Now, one of the caveats here is, okay, but what about infrastructure? Entrepreneurs don't build schools, they don't build bridges, they don't do those sort of things. Well, the answer to that is, to some extent they do. There is private-public partnerships. There is, different types of approaches that can also actually have entrepreneurial initiatives involved in providing, infrastructure developments. But overall, when it comes to infrastructure developments, one has to maybe delegate some of it to the state, but then that doesn't necessarily have to be debt financed. Okay, we're not talking here about excluding the state from everything and having some sort of stateless organization of people. That's not what we're arguing for here. What we're arguing for here is that we don't have debt financing of projects. The government, like a company, like a family, should balance their budget. It's the best thing a government can do. Now, let me give the first, there's two fundamental arguments against debt-financed government infrastructure build-outs. The first one is that debt financing is borrowing money from future generations for today's investment. Now, that in itself is not necessarily wrong if you do exactly what you're supposed to do, which is invest in the future. There is the fundamental argument against that, though, is that the future generations whose money we're mortgaging don't have a say in what we're doing today. So we are making decisions on behalf of future generations with their money without them having a say. So this is why this doesn't work. And by the way, the data shows it doesn't work. I'm going to talk about this in a second. The second important point against debt-financed state industrial policy is the calculation problem, as explained by Hayek and other Austrian economists. So even if you abstract from corruption, from narcissistic vanity, all of that stuff that drives humans and makes powerful humans often very bad allocators of assets, even if you abstract all that away, you still have the calculation problem, which is that a centrally planned agency, whether it's the government in Germany or in the United States, conducting industrial policy will always be wrong, late, mismanaged, and all of that stuff. There's a quote that actually Lanz Precht mentioned, which is very interesting. Wolfgang Schäuble, one of the frugal finance ministers that Germany had about 15 years ago when that Greek crisis happened, he said that, look, even if I have the money, it's still hard to spend it. And what he means with that is that government money often gets lost in red tape, in bureaucracy and corruption. So even if you wanted to spend it properly, it's still hard to do. So now let me dissect some of the arguments which were made either by Lanz Precht directly or indirectly by them quoting other people. Let's start with the big one, Keynes versus Austrian economists. Look, Keynes doesn't work. the richest countries in the world today are countries like Singapore and Switzerland and Dubai on the verge of becoming one of the richest places because they exactly don't follow Keynesian politics. So the proof's in the pudding. The data shows the US as a country has been incredibly prosperous whenever they applied, whenever they went as far away from Keynes as they could. Keynes, in my opinion, is not even an economist. He's a charlatan because there is no real basis for anything he says. Economic, philosophical, all he does, he sells to politicians what they want to hear because it is incredibly easy to convince a politician that they should be spending more money, right? This is the problem. And I believe Keynes knew that, and he used the circumstances of World War I and all of that, and I don't want to go into their history. If you want to know more about Keynes, read there's books written about him. The point here is not, I don't even want to dwell too much on his personality. I just want to say that his theories and his particular approach towards economic policy, it's not even wrong. It's nonsense. If you take a family, like a family, a husband and a wife and a couple of kids, if they keep spending more than they make, they will eventually get divorced. Their kids will end up in a bad place. The whole situation will fall apart. You can use the same argument in a biotope with plants or animals. If they spend more resources than they have available to them, they will eventually die. The same applies to, there's no different, it's not like a government has some sort of free pass. The government is just the accumulation of individual wealth. That's what the government is. By the way, the nation state, as we know it, is only 150 years old. It's nothing. And we can even abstract from there. We can just keep a general form of society, which is just a bunch of people living together, deciding to share certain resources. It's okay to pool resources for defense, for maybe even economic growth, such as infrastructure. It's okay to pool resources. I always use the example of Salt Lake City to me. If you've ever been to Salt Lake City, if you haven't, go. It's an interesting place. And here's why it's so interesting, because it's an absolutely inhabitable place. It's a desert. It's water, sun, ozone pollution, all that kind of stuff. People got there in the mid-19th century and built a society there. And I'm always thinking, look, those people, they had to manage as frugal as they can. There was no waste in that society. By the way, there still isn't. And you can argue as much as you want about the Mormons and the sect and the fanatic religious approaches that they have towards life there. But the one thing that they have is they're very, very efficient in generating wealth. And they're very wealthy. And not just money-wise, but in a sort of David Deutschian way, which is that they just have a lot of possible transformations that they can do as a society because they have resources. And my point, the reason I'm using this example is if you abstract away from nation state and EU and all of that stuff, and you just think about, in principle, is it good to indebt yourself for investments? The answer is no. Now, having said that, of course, there are situations when, for example, businesses issue debt to invest. For example, Tesla did that. Lots of businesses do that. And the question there comes up sometimes. There is the Miller-Modigliani theorem in finance, which basically says it doesn't even matter if it's debt or equity because it's the same thing. Now, I don't want to go there. This is going a little bit into the weeds of finance. My point is, though, that in fact, there really isn't such a thing as debt. When Tesla issues debt to finance their company, there's not, the difference between debt and equity on the margin is very small. What I mean with that is that in fact, every company should actually, or as an investor, okay, what I'm saying is as an investor, you should never really buy bonds of companies because, look, if things go bad, you're going to lose money. And if they go well, you don't participate on the upside. Now, yes, of course, you will be the first in line when there's liquidation and all that. But come on, I mean, the headaches you have and the money that you sometimes you have to wait for years to get your money back. So it's a complete nightmare. But my point here is that these types of investments, when a company issues debt to invest in factories and stuff, what they are doing is they're mortgaging their own future cash flows. That's very important. What a country does when they issue debt, they're mortgaging future generations' money, future generations' cash flows. Because I have yet to see a country that has issued debt and then promised to pay it back in 5 years or 10 years, which would be mortgaging the people who actually make those decisions cash flow. So that's the problem. It goes back to my first point that we're mortgaging people, future generations, cash flows. They don't have a say. If they had a say in it, if we could find a structure, and by the way, I have an essay in the workings about this, where I want to talk about this a little bit more structured in an essay, and then maybe also in a short story that I'm writing about this to illustrate the point, right? If we could have a system where let's say, there are people, they say, let's say we should give, nature should have rights, animals should have rights. Well, why not future generations? And we could represent them. There could be law firms, maybe, organizations that represent future generations that go to court and fight for their rights. So if we could express future generations' incentives and preferences, then we could maybe talk about that. The problem, though, is they don't have a say, and therefore mortgaging their future, their cash flows, the cash flows of our kids and our grandkids, is, it's not just unethical, but it is also terribly, terribly bad form, because it creates moral hazard, which just means it's the Guns N' Roses thing. I used to do a little, and a little won't do, so I started doing more and more. The second problem with that financing, again, I mentioned it, it's the calculation problem. It gets amplified with the moral hazard problem, right? If you're wrong and you're not even being accountable for your mistakes, you're just going to keep making those mistakes and you're going to accumulate. And this is exactly what's happening. Almost every country which has started on a debt trajectory has ended up in an Argentina / Germany 1920s / you name it type of nightmare scenario. There's never been a case where a country went to 2 times GDP debt and then came back and paid back all their debt. This doesn't happen. So the data proves Keynes wrong. The data proves this debt financing is wrong. It's not good for the incentive structure of the population. It's not good for the incentive structure of politicians. It creates distortions in politics. And the biggest distortion, of course, which is the next point that I just want to mention tangentially, because I think this is a much bigger issue on its own, which is if we use debt for redistribution instead of investment, then we're totally falling off the cliff. Because now we're talking about not just not investing money properly or not letting future generations participate in the investments that are supposed to benefit them too. No, we're taking money from them and giving it to current generations, very often for consumption without any kind of investment. Whether this is vanity degrees at very expensive private universities, whether this is just consumption in terms of Louis Vuitton or fancy houses, it's all the same. It has no future benefit. It's not an investment. Let me address one more thing, which is this point that Lanz Precht made about this one writer that apparently wrote that capitalism only works for communism, should be implemented. What he means with that is that if we rationalize everything, if we put a price on everything, that's a bad thing. It can't be done. There should be this sort of tacit reciprocity between humans without putting a price. Now, my point here is this. Look, every time we try to get away from rationality when it comes to interactions with humans, we end up in utopia. Humans are reciprocity animals. Humans are actually calculating when they give something, how much they get back. Whether this is your 5-year-old that is upset because you gave his sister one cookie more than he got, or whether this is your grandma or your brother or your sister. People do that. Now, it might sound a little bit harsh if we put everything in contract and everything has a price, but this is exactly how we think. So all that the capitalism or this rational choice theory and price theory and monetary transaction theory, or whatever you want to call it, all it attempts to do is take a natural process that's already in place and just put real numbers on it, make it more transparent. More transparency is good. It's not bad. And what Lanz and Precht are alluding to here is that somehow it's bad. That it's okay if we keep it a little bit blurred, because if we don't know, then somehow we're less unhappy or something like that. This is the same argument like the Federal Reserve is making, or that famous guy in Europe, in the EU, is making, that sometimes it's necessary to lie. Or the Fed is saying, well, it's okay if we monetize debt so it doesn't look like we're actually taxing people. All of these things are bad because, number one, people aren't stupid. They know exactly what's going on. And number two, if you take transparency out of the system, you make it even more corrupt. So to summarize, my reaction to Lanz and Precht, Einstürzende Altbauten is, no, that is bad. You don't want that. And Germany is on the right not to want that. Now, the point here is, of course, they have an EU to finance. They have some sort of tacit agreement with other EU countries to keep that thing alive. In my opinion, the EU is, as an idea, a good idea, but the euro and this current common currency, that's a bad idea. I think we need more competition. We need more try and error. We need different types of organizations within Europe, and then try the ones that work better, instead of having this crude top-down system that is in place now. But overall, again, that is bad because that financing for industrial policy doesn't work, because you're mortgaging future generations, and you have the calculation problem. And on top of that, you have the redistribution problem, which what I mean with that is that, look, you can have redistribution. You can do that. If as a society you want to give money from the rich, take it from the rich and give it to the poor, you can do that. But what you cannot do is disguise industrial policy, borrow money from future generations and redistribute it to current people who come with open arms and just take and take and take. That is wrong. That is ethically wrong, morally wrong, and economically it's a disaster. Thank you.